In this video, I will tell you about a new feature available in Nerdio Manager for Enterprise version 3.1 and newer called RI, or Reserved Instances Analytics. The assumption is you're familiar with what reserved instances are in Azure, but at a high level, just as a quick reminder, reserved instances are the ability to prepay or reserve and then pay on a monthly basis for either a term of 1 year or a term of 3 years, certain amount of CPU cores in a certain Azure region for a certain type of VM family. The reason you would do that is because you're able to get a very significant discount on the cost of compute. Typically, the average discount for a 1-year reservation is 40% compared to pay-as-you-go prices. And for a 3-year reservation, it is about 60% compared to pay-as-you-go pricing. So using RIs, or reserved instances, is a good way to save on compute. Now, a lot of times people think about reserved instances in contrast to autoscaling. And it rarely makes sense to purchase reserved instances for all of your hosts in all of the host pools rather than using autoscaling. Because as I mentioned, even with a 3-year reserved instance, you are saving about 60%. Whereas with autoscaling, you're typically saving 70% and more, because the amount of time that the VM is used out of a typical week or a typical month is generally below 30%, generally in the low 20%, because on the weekends it's not used, at night it's not used. So the actual work hours, 40 or 50 hours out of 168 hours in a week, is generally well below 40%. And that's why autoscaling with pay-as-you-go instances makes more sense. However, even if you're using autoscaling, it makes sense to purchase reserved instances for a certain number of cores, of CPU cores, but figuring out how many cores to purchase is a difficult and analytics intensive exercise. So what we've done in Nerdio Manager is provided you with a simple guide that will look at prior autoscale history of a particular host pool and provide you with recommendations on what type of reserved instances to purchase. So for example, this is my demo environment. I don't have a tremendous amount of usage here, but let's take a look at a few examples. If we go under the dropdown and under autoscale, there will be a new option called RI Analytics. And under RI Analytics, we'll be able to select a time range to use for our analysis. So we can say, give me a recommendation based on the last 30 days, based on the last week, based on the last month, etc. So you can select different ranges, including a custom range. Last 30 days is generally going to be the most representative. And then the system will calculate several metrics for us. So it will tell us, hey, there is, over the selected period, which is the last 30 days, there have been 1,517 CPU hours, which means if you take the number of hours that VMs were powered on, multiplied by the number of CPU cores in each VM, this is the number of CPU hours over the last 30 days. Now, if you take this number and you convert it into CPU months, which is what we're interested in, meaning we're going to project this and figure out, well, I know how many hours, but how many complete months is that? We're going to use a 730-hour month, and we're going to come up with a number of 2.13, which means for the month, I've had 2.13 cores that I expect to consume based on the behavior in the last 30 days. And based on this data, Nerdio Manager is providing us with an RI recommendation and telling us to purchase an RI in the North Central US region of this type of VM, which is the type of VM being used in this host pool. And it's telling us to purchase 2 VMs. And the reason it's telling us to purchase 2 VMs because you can, purchase 2 CPU cores, not 2 VMs. So 1 VM with 2 CPU cores would be sufficient. And the reason it's 2 is because it figures out at what point are you better off having a reserved CPU core versus a pay-as-you-go. In this case, it rounds it down to 2. But if you have a much larger number of cores that are being consumed, it will do all of the background magic and analytics to recommend to you what type of, how many cores to purchase. And if this is a number, let's say this is 100 cores, that means you can purchase these cores in any VM size as long as it's within this family and within this region. That means, let's imagine we have 100 cores that are recommended. That means we can purchase, 3 32 core VMs, which will give us a total of 96, plus one 4-core VM, which is going to give us a total of 100 cores. And that's because with reserved instances, there's a concept of RI flexibility, where Azure will automatically determine how to apply individual cores, even if the reservation is not for the exact VM type, but it will do things based on the total number of cores within the family, within the region. So this is the RI Analytics feature that helps you reduce the cost of compute by an additional 60% or 40%, depending on the duration of your reservation, above and beyond autoscaling. So autoscaling will reduce the amount of cores necessary from, let's say, 100 cores down to 25 cores on a typical 40-hour-a-week type of a host pool. And then those 25 cores can be reserved to reduce the cost by an additional 40% with a 1-year reservation or 60% with a 3-year reservation, which brings down the cost of compute in AVD with Nerdio Manager down to really maybe like something like 80 or 85% lower than turning on VMs and paying the pay-as-you-go rates, which is what's typically done without Nerdio Manager. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.